160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. What a pleasure and an honor it is to be able to walk around this hill with you today and talk about strategy, mostly Lee and Longstreet. We'll bring in General Meade a little bit and kind of give a wrap up of the end of the first day of the battle to give you a segue into the second day in the morning. Now, we're standing on Oak Hill. For those of you that are new to the story, I know some of you are steeped in the story, so just bear with me, but there's some folks mixed in every audience that are fairly new. We're standing on Oak Hill. This was a key position on the first day's battlefield, and whoever controlled this hill really controlled the battlefield. Once the Confederates got here and they posted their artillery here and they began to fire shots down into that valley where Cutler's brigade and various other Union brigades were concealed facing west, they were suddenly exposed from a wide angle. And the artillery was able to just almost use the fields down below. Confederate artillery used the fields down below like a bowling alley. And it raked into Cutler's flank and caused him to have to fall back into those woods over there. And the Iverson's North Carolinians would charge those woods. The reason why there were Union troops in those woods to begin with in the afternoon battle of July 1st was because Confederate artillery got here before Union artillery and was able to fire right down the line. And along with firing from the west, from Hare Ridge, where you see the red roof barn out in the distance, they had a crossfire on the Union position. The Union actually had sent the 11th Corps here in a race to get here to this hill. There was an actual race to this hill. And the 11th Corps fell short down in the fields below and had to stay in some ground and had really no good artillery positions. And the guns up here were frowning down on them, and they were stuck in no man's land. They would try to form at right angles with the First Corps, which was facing west and defending Confederate advances from the west. This hill was the pivot, sort of like the turnstile. And if you control this hill, eventually you control the battlefield. The Southerners arguably weren't as efficient with their attacks, and the Union contributed greatly to that. But just the mere fact the Confederates won the race to this hill largely determined the outcome of the battle. So the hill has a monument on it that represents unity between North and South. The base of it is made with granite from Maine, and the shaft above it is dolomite limestone. It's made to look like one of the original 7 ancient wonders of the world, the lighthouse at Alexandria. If you lived in the 300s, 200s BC, there was a bucket list of places you were told. If there was a travel channel back there, you were back then. You'd be told to see the pyramids at Giza, the lighthouse at Alexandria, the Temple of Artemis. There were various incredible structures, and one of them was the lighthouse at Alexandria. It was built right along Alexandria, Egypt, overlooking the Mediterranean, and they would light a big bonfire on the top of it. It looked very much like that did. And then a copper shield was put behind it and was used to reflect out the sea so that ships wouldn't run aground. So the idea here, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, is this monument is suggesting that the nation would never shipwreck again. And anytime you have a flame that's unquenchable, it means eternity. John and Jackie Kennedy came here in 1962, went around the battlefield. Tragically, his assassination in November of 1963, Jackie contacted the park. She talked to the superintendent. She said, John and I loved our visit last year with Colonel Sheed. He took us around. John particularly liked that eternal flame. Can you give me the specs on it so I can use it for his gravesite at Arlington? That's where that inspiration came from. But anytime you have a flame constantly burning, it means eternity. And this one was dedicated to eternal peace. It was sort of like North and South agreed to bury the hatchet. Notice on the front, there are 2 ladies. They're just called the Tale of the 2 Ladies. It's a story in ancient Egypt of one lady represents the Upper Nile, the other represents the Lower Nile. And at times there was a rift between Upper and Lower Nile, but now they're arm in arm again. And the overture for you and I, and for the veterans that were here for the last great reunion in 1938 when it was dedicated, the 75th anniversary, 250,000 people were here. The overture is for us is we're supposed to discern that the North and South are back together again, arm in arm, taking care of each other. So that's your picture there. I should also say that I interviewed several years ago a man that was 5 years old here at the time, and he was in his 90s when I interviewed him. And I asked him some questions and just didn't get in his way and let him talk, and wanted to see if what he had to say was valid, because I know enough about that reunion in 1938, the last great reunion of veterans. You and I, just a couple years ago, saw the 75th on television of D-Day. The equivalent occurred here in 1930. The last great Civil War reunion was here. And in any case, I asked this guy several questions. One, I said, what do you remember from it? Real broad questions. Just let his stream of conscience go. He said it was really hot. Well, I knew right away he was right, because a lot of people said that. He said that he said in a place called Oxford. I said, you mean New Oxford? He said, could be. But he said, our car overboiled, the radiator overboiled. And he said, my father had to stop to pour water into it. He said, I remember that. I remember the steam pouring out. I said, what else do you remember? He said, well, back then, we didn't have cell phones. So he said, when the veterans encamped, and they encamped down in the valley below down there, it was sawdust paths set up in a checkerboard design, and there was latrines, and there was water stations and everything they needed. There were 1930s automobiles parked all down there. And this fellow said, he said, the veterans set apart, but they would send messages. They wouldn't talk by cell phone, but they sent messages, notes. And he said they would pay us kids a nickel if we would carry the note. He couldn't remember what he said, but he remembered carrying a note. I said, can you remember anything else? I wrote down everything he said. He said, yes, I remember that odd flapping sound in the breeze of the empty sleeve, the amputated arm. Ooh. So those were some of the memories that stuck with him even at age 5, and he was in his 90s. And it was clear by the end of the interview it was completely authentic. So now that anniversary, or that 75th, was a kind of a goodbye to the veterans. Many of them had been holding on to make it to that date, and then they soon passed from the scene after that. I did mention their encampment. They were down in the fields below, and then they walked up here, those that were able to walk up here, almost like it was a holy hill to dedicate this monument, and it's been burning ever since. One last point I'll make, I want to make an artistic point. Some of you know I have a wife who's an art teacher, an art professor now, and she taught me to be more visual. I'm very left-brained, very analytical. She said, take time to paint the picture. There are always visual learners in your audience. Someone will thank you for it. So that's really what I'm up to. That monument is also called neoclassicism. Neoclassicism was very popular in the late 1800s and even into the early 1900s. Neoclassicism, it means new classics. The classics were taken, ancient Greece, Rome, Egypt, and then new wrinkles were put in them to try to bridge the present and the past. We think of the United States, but the people that lived after the Civil War, America was not that. America was searching for its identity. Europe looked upon America as backwoodsy, frontiers, undeveloped, uncultured, uncouth, lacking institutions. And so Americans responded after the Civil War by putting up all these classical monuments to associate themselves with great civilizations of the past. By weaving American soldiers into monuments, for instance, in a classical scene, it associated America with great civilizations that had come from before. And that's neoclassicism. A classic example would be the Lincoln Memorial. That oversized Lincoln sitting in an oversized chair is really an allusion to Zeus sitting in his chair, and the Lincoln Memorial is a simulation, a copy of the temple to Zeus on Mount Olympus. So you see how you conflate the two and merge the two together? And there are a lot of examples I could give you here on the battlefield. But that's one, and there's a blending of past and present, then and now, associating American history with ancient Egypt. And that goes on with neoclassicism all across the country during that period. In this country, it was called the City Beautiful movement. Neoclassicism was a big part of that, and in Europe, it was called the Beaux Arts movement. So we've come to a place where the veterans assembled for the last time, and did so in 1938, to talk about the overall operations and General Lee in particular, but also mentioning me towards the end. And so I'm going to pick up here initially with the brilliance of Buford's advance towards those mountains. If you look out towards the mountains, they're a primary feature related to this battle. That's the Blue Ridge Mountains. Geologists say 200 million years ago, two plates collided there and thrusted upward, creating the Blue Ridge. Mold formed on the Blue Ridge. That became the first topsoil. You've heard this in a science class somewhere. And the incredible collision that thrusted upward to create those mountains shattered the sandstone and shell surface, just like broken glass, from the mountains to here and then another 30 miles east of here all the way to York. Well, anytime you have shattered topsoil, top surface, the subsurface will come up to fill in the cracks, like mortar between brick. Molten rock, lava came up and filled in the cracks. Well, over time, the original soil, which we could call more loosely sedimentary, and the volcanic rock, which we call igneous, that filled in the breaks, over time, the sedimentary, the original top crust, eroded away, leaving shards of volcanic rock sticking up. Water freezes and thaws, it expands and contracts, and the freezing and thawing, expanding and contracting, it would find its way into crevices of this volcanic rock, this lava rock, and find wedges and cause the rocks to break and fall over. And that's why there's Devil's Kitchen and Devil's Den and Little Round Top and Culp's Hill, and the area is so rocky, and while there's stone walls aligning both sides of roads all across the battlefield, this area geologically is one of the rockiest places on Earth. So my wife and I tried to put a water garden in the backyard of a house we had in town, and you shovel, the first thing you do, you just hit rock and stone everywhere. If you dig a foundation around here and build a house, it's there to stay. It's solid rock all around here. So another thing that ruptured with that huge collision, in some areas where there have been plate tectonics like that, several stories down, petroleum is ruptured, and you start having petroleum leaks, and people know where to drill based on that. In this area, what ruptured a couple stories down below the surface with that major collision was water. So this area became very leaky, and water was just running all over the place. That's why you have Minchie Springs and Cataline Springs and Natural Springs and Cadore Springs and Spangler Spring. And we go on and on. There are a lot of springs. And then the springs leak into runs or runoffs. Willoughby Run here on the first day's battlefield. And then there's Lady Run where they're doing the reenactment. There's Plum Run, which came to be known as Bloody Run at the base of the Round Top. Weinbrenner Run. And you can go on and on with those various runs that are all across the battlefield. Well, the runs, like little capillaries, flow into two creeks that frame the battlefield. To the east is, and running north-south, is the Rock Creek. And then to the west and running north-south, parallel with it, is Marsh Creek. Those two creeks form metaphorically what looked like a goalpost for a well-kicked football to go through. And where the two creeks connect south of here, several miles, just across the Maryland border, into the Monocacy. This is where the Monocacy River starts. The Monocacy River flows south into the Potomac. This was the Army of the Potomac. They always fought battles at the furthest extremities of the Potomac River. So this is where the Potomac River begins. It's also where the Chesapeake Bay begins, because the Potomac flows into the Chesapeake Bay, which flows into the Atlantic. So you have to understand, it's like building a train set, and you start out with a plywood, and you have to paint it, and you put the granules down, and then eventually buildings and a track. You have to set up the battlefield and look at its terrain features, because they're vital. The reason why this ground, take a look behind you where the cars are parked, that's western McPherson Ridge, and then parallel with it in the woods where the other ridge runs parallel with it is eastern McPherson Ridge. The reason why those ridges stick up, and then further west where the Red Roof Barn is, that's Hare Ridge. All these parallel ridges, what they are the result of are those two plates colliding, and like you taking an 8x11 piece of paper and folding it together, having ripples in it. And so those ripples became places for Union cavalry to cover and conceal infantry who were coming up behind them. The Confederates had to be careful approaching each one. They didn't have a drone to fly over and see exactly what was on the other side, so they had to send out skirmishers and get a sense of how many troops were in front of them before they advanced. That was all a part of the delay process. But the terrain factors in greatly into that. Now, back to the brilliance of Buford. When Buford's cavalry arrived here, he hit the crossroads just south of it. Gettysburg's known for a great many roads. In the early Republic, that's early American history, 1789 to about 1850, there were very few places with multiple good roads. This area had 10 roads. They were already naturally good because of the hard surface that I described to you. But then a number of them were graveled and improved, macadamized roads, including the road that's out there that runs from right to left, where you see cars just crawling along in the distance, the main venue that the Confederates marched into Gettysburg on, and the one that Buford contested, the Chambersburg Pike, or the Cashtown Road. So, wheeled vehicles, if you're carrying, let's say, 500 to 1,000 pounds of ammunition, and you have 6 horses and mules, you can't go up a steep grade. You can only go on a level surface. There was only one pass that the Confederates could come through from the west side of the mountains, where they started their journey from Virginia, the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley, and to the Susquehanna Valley, where they spread out and gathered all kinds of produce and grains. There was only one pass that would allow their heavy vehicles and their shoot horses to come through. Only one. And it's not Turner, Fox, Crampton, Ravens Rock, Fairfield Gap. It's none of those gaps. It's the Cashtown Gap. It was almost predictable where the Confederates, the mouse hole they were going to come through to get from one side of the mountains to the other. And the mountains are crucial because the Southerners followed them like a plumb bob chalk line from Virginia up through Maryland into Pennsylvania, in the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley, using the mountains like the Great Wall of China to shield and disguise their movement. And then they came through very predictably through the one pass, and that's why the majority of their army came through that pass, the Cashtown Pass, 17 miles west of here. And as they were marching in, when Buford fired on them, he didn't realize the Confederates were 4 columns wide in a 16-foot wide Cashtown Pike Road. And that Confederate snake that Lieutenant Marcellus Jones fired into probably around 7:30 in the morning, it was 27 miles long. That's why Buford and the cupola, off to my left, is the Lutheran Theological Seminary. That was his version of a drone. He just tried to get up as high as he could, see what he could see. And he could see columns of dust all the way to the mountains, chalky dust, stirred up from troops and wheeled vehicles marching in from the mountains who had come through that pass. Buford could see that, and he yelled down to John Reynolds, who was at ground level below. From the cupola, John Buford yelled, "The devil's to pay." In other words, there's going to be a lot of young men that are not going to make it through this day. There's no way to stop that freight train from coming in. So what Buford did, though, on the 30th that was so smart is he rode out along the Chambersburg Pike, 8 miles west of Gettysburg to Cashtown. And he came face to face with Heath's division, A.P. Hill's Corps, the lead elements of the Confederate Army at that point on the Chambersburg Pike. This was the 14th major battle. There were no surprises. Buford could just look at the flags and knew he was facing Heath's division and A.P. Hill's Corps. You're looking at least a corps, and you figure that Longstreet must be behind him. So that information was carried back to John Reynolds, 5 miles south of here at Moritz Tavern, beautifully restored today, where Oliver O. Howard and John Reynolds would spend all evening poring over maps. What were they doing? They were looking at the location of all the corps. The Union Army was spread out over a 40-mile radius. That's what you do in operations on different roads. He told everybody to take a good close look at the roads so that they could use them in the best, most efficient way to unify the Army. When you maneuver from operations to point of contact, you reduce from 40 miles in width to about 4 miles in width at the most. So Buford sent word down to Reynolds. Reynolds was talking with Howard. They were looking at where all the corps were, the different roads, trying to figure out how to consolidate them from 40 miles in width to 3 or 4 miles in width. And that information passed to Reynolds from Buford, told him that A.P. Hill's Corps was only 8 miles west. Now, what did Buford do besides gathering information? His mere presence set the table for how the battle would proceed. In fact, it might be the singularly most important act in determining how the battle unfolded. When Buford rode out towards the mountains in search of the Confederates, who were rumored to be coming through that pass, when he did that, as he approached them, he was threatening their escape route. He was threatening their escape route. Now, hold that thought for a minute. I'm going to bring in logistics here for a minute. The Confederates were here. Why were they in Pennsylvania? People say, well, shoes, different things. What was the real reason they were here in Pennsylvania? They were here in Pennsylvania to gather food, grocery shopping. And why? Because we would say today that the South had supply chain shortages. And I'll be brief on this, but if you get this right, everything else flows. And when we get to the end of the first day and our overlook over there to the right, and we talk about Lee, it's going to make a whole lot more sense if I lay these footers now. The Southerners, because the Northern Navy, the United States Navy, blocked Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, North Carolina, the Chesapeake Bay, and then the fall of Vicksburg about the same time as Gettysburg cut the South off from the Mississippi, the Gulf of Mexico. They lost all of their meat products in Texas with the fall of Vicksburg. And with the stranglehold of the Union Navy all the way around the South, blocking them off from access to water, the South had very little industry, so they depended on trading their cotton to Russia, Germany, France, and England. Those nations needed the South's cotton. It was a particular fiber that worked in their machines. Tens of thousands of people were unemployed in Europe and picketing the streets. They lost their jobs because they couldn't get Southern cotton. That was the Southerners' ace card in diplomacy. But the South had so doubled down in cotton, they lacked basic staples. Did you know their wheat, barley, rye, oats? Some of that came from Pennsylvania before the war, transported by rail. Did you know the South lacked basic staples, tomatoes and potatoes, produce of all kinds, because they had so doubled down on a few people getting rich with cotton that they lacked basic food. So the Northern Anaconda Plan was to cut the South off from being able to trade with Europe. They couldn't. The South, once they could no longer trade, they couldn't get morphine, they couldn't get railroad track replacement parts, which came from Pennsylvania. They didn't use petroleum then. They used whale oil to lubricate their locomotives. They couldn't get whale oil. That came from New England. They couldn't get basic grains. And then the Union Army camped out in the South in battles of 1st and 2nd Bull Run and Cedar Mountain, Chancellorsville, Fredericksburg, mainly between Washington and Richmond along that I-95 corridor was where 66% of all Civil War battles occurred. In that area, northern and central Virginia was just a blighted land. And the result is there were significant food shortages. A bag of groceries in Richmond in 1861 was $6. In 1863, $60. So inflation was through the roof. There's a class that I teach in the evenings, and we just got through Gettysburg, and I had them read a story of the bread riots in Richmond in March of 1863. And there was a reporter who got a tip there was going to be a riot in downtown Richmond. So he showed up the next morning expecting the riot, and he found a woman standing there with a crowbar in her hand in front of a bakery. And he said, "What are you about to do with that?" the reporter said. She turned and looked behind her, and she could see other rioters who were holding clubs and all kinds of things about ready to riot. And she looked back, and she noticed that he was staring at her arm. And it embarrassed her. She realized that her arm was about that big around. And she said, trembling, "We deserve to eat." She smashed the bakery window, and they started taking out pies and cakes. That was going on in the South. People were starving. And so the armies, by fighting across Virginia, had been using up all the food. All the orchards were stripped bare. Fences like you see behind you for miles had been turned into firewood over 2 years of war. People were homeless in Culpeper, Warrenton, Alexandria. It was a barren place to be. So the main reason, you have to answer the whys and the so whats. Otherwise, when we get to our main crystallized moment in the program of Lee and Longstreet and so forth, it won't make sense unless I lay these footers. That the answer to the why and the so what while the Southerners were here is to gather foodstuffs. It's not a coincidence they were here a month before harvest time. So the Southerners stole 20,000 Pennsylvania horses, 20,000 cows, 30,000 hogs, 20,000 sheep, 700,000 pounds daily ration of hay and oats to feed those animals. I was recently reading some other figures that are out there. I don't remember them exactly, but into the thousands of pounds of sugar and flour and bellows from furnaces. Sort of reminds me of the Grinch Stole Christmas. He goes back because he left a crumb under the tree, and Sad takes that and the lights off the tree too. They felt like, and they fed their army for 4 months out of that. So they spread out to the fingertips of the roads, the many roads of Gettysburg, so that they wouldn't be far from accessing a road. They would all coordinate on the same point. They could quickly, in half the time, find a central place like Gettysburg, the hub of a wheel, the many spokes or the many roads, and at a moment's notice, concentration time would be cut in half by condensing on Gettysburg. Does that make sense? Remember, Jomini said in his Art of War, and a third of the Army officers here at Gettysburg had studied under Dennis Harman at West Point and had lectured to them. Jomini said, battles have been lost by armies for no other reason than they failed to stay together. So when the Southerners were spread out like that, they were very vulnerable. But they had wagons the size of yellow school buses with 6 horses and mules, and they were going door to door over a 30-mile radius in this area at the fingertips of the spokes of all of these roads, so they could quickly access and converge here if they needed to, and tighten their belts and come back together. But as they went door to door with their rifles, they would give people, farmers in this area, Confederate money and tell them it would be worth something someday. And then they just filled up these wagons with grains. They fed, Lee's army was able, through coming into Pennsylvania, and a stopgap measure, to feed their army for 4 months because of coming up here. So logistically, that was their primary concern. By coming into Pennsylvania and taking the harvest and threatening Harrisburg, that assured that the Union Army would come north. Because Lincoln, to be reelected, and the elections were gradual. They started in April and they continued. People lived far from the courthouse, so it went on for months until November. The beginning of the elections were about 8 months away. Lincoln's party lost key congressional seats at the state and federal level, and they lost key governorships in '62 at the midterms. And the projections were they were going to lose more in '64, that Lincoln himself might not be reelected. People were shopping for peace. There was a draft that added to people's upsetness. So the Southerners gambled that if they got into Pennsylvania, took the harvest, threatened Harrisburg, Lincoln would have to send the Union Army north instead of walking into an unprotected capital, Richmond, Virginia. One of the reasons why Slocum was upset for days, and it eventually ended up over a slightly different circumstances, him resigning, was he wanted to march right into Richmond. This is why we've been fighting first and second Bull Run in Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, where it's on to Richmond campaigns. The Southerners are not protecting Richmond. They're in Pennsylvania. You can just walk right into the city. And Lincoln let it be known through his chief of staff, the Hooker, commanding the Union Army of the Potomac then, let him know that's not the goal. The capital, marching into a city like Richmond, is not the goal. The goal is to remove the Southerners from Pennsylvania. So the Southerners gambled that if they got into Pennsylvania, gathered the harvest, threatened Harrisburg, Lincoln would have to order the Union Army north to protect the state. Today, when you're running for president, it's been this way for the last 75 years. You have to carry Florida and Ohio, usually Michigan and Pennsylvania, and the party out of power spends 4 years trying to flip several of them back into their column. Back then, you had to carry Pennsylvania and New York, or you had no chance of winning. For Lincoln not to defend the state, and the Southerners get away with highway robbery here, and do nothing about it, would doom his re-election. He would lose Pennsylvania. That's the gamble the Southerners took. And when you're desperate, you do desperate things. They figured they could come up here and do some grocery shopping, threaten Harrisburg, and wait for indications that the Union Army was moving north. That would draw the Union Army out of Pennsylvania. Farmers in Virginia would follow behind them, rebuild fences, replant fields, and they would hope that when the Southerners fell back, that those fields could be protected. So it was all about food and logistics. So when the Confederates were crossing that mountain on June the 30th, 160 years ago yesterday, Buford rode out that way. And when he did, what he was really doing was he was threatening the Confederate escape route. Now let's demonstrate this. Would you step forward, sir, and would you step forward? All right, and have your back to the mountains there. We're going to imagine that you are representing, actually, we're going to vary it up a little bit. Let's have you stand right here facing me. Now face me if you would. All right, and let's have you stand right over here. Okay, now I'm Buford, and I'm riding out. You are Confederates that are north of here in Carlisle, in that direction, and you're in the area of Fayetteville out that direction. The Confederates extend all the way around to the east, as far east as York, 30 miles from here, spread out, gathering up food stuff, grocery shopping. As that's going on, if I'm Buford and I ride out and I challenge you, we're going to now call you Heath's Division along the road. The moment I challenge you, and I'm there, I don't even have to fire a shot. When I'm there as Buford's Union Cavalry, behind you is the only pass you can escape with everything that you've collected over the last week that feeds your army for the next 4 months. So I'm seriously threatening your escape route. If you let me go by you, metaphorically I close the door, you're trapped in Pennsylvania, and that mountain is a wall to keep you from getting over. You have no way home. I've just closed the door behind you. So that's the brilliance of Buford's move. When he marched out, it wasn't just to see and verify the Confederates were there, to get a sense of their numbers, their strength, their location, their morale. It was to send a nonverbal message. We know where you came through from the Cumberland-Shenandoah Valley, from the west side of those mountains, here into the eastern side of the mountains and the Susquehanna Valley. And we know you have to go back out that way. So when Buford marched out, he was threatening the escape route. That assured that General Lee was going to recall all of the troops that were out gathering foodstuffs. The grocery shopping mission was over. Everybody had to gather here to make sure that door stayed open and they could get through the mountains. So General Lee writes about that in his official report to Jefferson Davis. He said, he didn't mention Buford by name, but he said there were reports the Union Army was moving very close to our escape route. Close to the mountains was his words. And he said, at that point, he said a battle became unavoidable. That is, just to fight to escape with the supplies. So that's very critical. Buford raised the stakes by threatening the way out. And that demanded that Lee recall all of his troops to make sure the escape route stayed open and that they got out. Now, as the Confederate infantry used the spokes of the various roads to come in on Gettysburg, they became a human wall. Step forward a little bit, if you would, to right there. You're the Confederate human wall while the wagon trains go behind you and over the mountains. Meanwhile, you're fighting the battle while the supply trains are escaping. Does everybody see that? So that's what's going on, this whole logistical thing. Lee even said at one point in his report to Jefferson Davis, he said a battle became unavoidable because the Union Army crowded his escape route. That was brilliant because that arrested Confederate movements in Pennsylvania and made the Confederates all report to the same location. Now, there was a contingency built in. The Confederates could either converge on Gettysburg, or if the Union Army had won the race to the juncture of the roads, that would mean the Confederates couldn't come together there. They couldn't converge there. So the contingency was, if the Union Army won the race to the hub of the wheel, the Confederates would just bypass the town and go to the mountains, and if they had to, fight in front of the mountains while the supplies escaped. So that's General Lee's main concern. Is you could argue, there's an old adage, amateurs discuss tactics, experts discuss logistics. And you could argue that the entire 3-day battle was a Confederate diversion while the supplies escaped, and a sealing off of the Union Army from the mouse hole 17 miles west for all those supply trains to get out. Sometimes you have to attack to buy time to evacuate. So think of it that way. Now, keep all of that in mind as we set up really, really big picture. I'm going to take you over now to an overlook, and we're going to talk about strategy at the end of the day, not only from Lee's perspective, but we're going to bring in Meade's perspective too. So let's make our way over toward your left. Beautiful overlook over there. hoped the Union Army would make mistakes and he would be able to capitalize. Plenty of room for error. You create a cushion for your defense. So this is really a defense of Washington. And from Meade's perspective, the question was, is it better to defend Washington here in Pennsylvania, or is it better to defend Washington down in Maryland? And originally his defensive position was covering major roads that extend out like sun's rays from Baltimore and Washington in the direction of south central Pennsylvania, where we are. And astride those roads, running roughly east-west, he set up a defensive position to cover roads that would lead into Washington and Baltimore. It came to be known as the Pipe Creek Line. Battles are often named after water, because armies are very dependent on water. There's Wilson's Creek, Stones River, Chickamauga, Bull Run, Antietam Creek. Armies are named after water. Army of Potomac, James, Cumberland, Tennessee, Ohio, Mississippi. Armies were as dependent on water then as armies today are dependent on petroleum. So you can't fight about, just like you can't build a house without septic, water, and electricity. If you have kids, a good nearby public school, fire department, and a police department, they're prerequisites to building a home. They're prerequisites to fighting a battle. There has to be 3 elements present, or you can't fight a battle there during the Civil War. There has to be water, road, and rail. You have to have all 3 come together. And the Battle of Pipe Creek would have been just like the Battle of Bull Run. It would have been another battle named after water. Had the battle here at Gettysburg been given its water name, it would have been the Battle of the Monocacy Rock Creek. So it's the only major battle that wasn't given an alternative water name. And there are reasons for that. But in any case, and they have to do with historiography rather than the actual condition on the battlefield. A horse or a mule drinks 12 to 15 gallons of water a day. The Union Army, by conservative estimates, had 38,000 horses and mules here, pulling miles of ambulances, ordnance wagons, artillery vehicles, pots, pans, axe, picks, shovels, tents, hay, barley, rye, oats, and then throw in the cavalry, and exponentially the numbers increase. You got a lot of horses. The Confederates had 20,000 stolen sheep, 30,000 hogs, 20,000 cows, 20,000 horses to go along with their 40,000 horses they already had, pulling miles of ambulances, ordnance wagons, and artillery vehicles. It looked like Noah's Ark out there along the mountains as all those animals were going through and back to Virginia, in some cases even as the battle was progressing. So these animals all drink anywhere from 5 to 10 gallons of water a day. Humans drink up to 1 gallon of water a day. There were 175,000 humans here. I did some number crunching once and found that at least, conservative estimates, around 30 pails or small buckets of water were used during the 3-day battle just to sponge the artillery. You have to take what looks like a giant Q-tip and sponge the barrel with water. And it quenches really quick because the barrel's so hot, but you have to put out the fire from the previous charge before you put in a fresh powder charge. So there's water spewing and steaming. Rail, which eventually arrives here within 5 days after the battle, start bringing in care packages from all over the North, and the equivalent of FEMA and the American Red Cross and Habitats for Humanity and National Guard, all those groups that would be brought in today in a natural disaster, a flood. The equivalent started to roll in by rail after the battle. For 4 months. There was a major hospital east of Gettysburg called Camp Letterman. The rail completely supplied that and then took the wounded out. That's all run by steam. This is the first industrial revolution. Second industrial revolution later in the century is combustible engines and electric grids. Early in the century, it's steam. Civil War is the first modern war. Steam is a big part of that. So water is essential for your railroads, for your artillery, for the soldiers, for your animals, and you could predict where the armies were going to meet just based on where the water comes together. Did you know the Susquehanna, which the Confederates operated on, and the Chesapeake Bay both come together here in Adams County? They actually come together. So the Confederates were operating off of the Susquehanna River, earlier in the campaign, the Union off the Monocacy River, and the two come together within about 4 miles of each other here at Gettysburg. So General Meade had his piped Clay Creek line, his Antietam Creek, if you will, is another creek named Battle. There was a rail depot 24 miles south at Westminster. By the third day of the battle, 4,000 tons of medical and food supplies there. Had the Union Army had any troubles here, they would have fallen back to cover that depot. Westminster to Gettysburg was what Kuwait was to Baghdad in the 5-year war in Iraq. It was the main logistical center. So General Meade had his defensive position to cover Washington at Pipe Clay Creek with the Western Maryland Railroad and a huge rail yard there to bring up goods from Baltimore. He would have liked to have fought there naturally, because you want to start a fight not too far away from your base of operations. Had the Confederates been successful, let's say at a battle closer to Westminster, the Union Army could just simply fall back into Washington, where there was 64 miles labyrinth of earthworks around the city. The Southerners didn't have siege equipment that you would bring up by locomotive, because you have to lob shells into a city. These are huge dictator-type cauldron pots, and they have to be brought up by rail. Sieges last 8 to 10 months, which means you need to have a food supply to sustain a surrounding of a city. They didn't have a big enough army to do that. They couldn't siege Washington, D.C. No way they could do that. So Meade would have liked to have fought, yes, a defense in depth, but not this far north. Gettysburg was 95 miles north. This was really risky. But he had to open an offensive option here for political reasons, and that is to show the state of Pennsylvania in time of emergency he would not let them get away with the great robbery. He would arrest their movements. He would defend the state in time of emergency. A president's #1 job in any era is to keep the country safe. The economy is really high, but it's keep the country safe. If he had not defended Pennsylvania, I don't know where things would have worked out for him in November of 1864. So Meade opened up this offensive option. When Buford got to the mountains and threatened the Confederates' escape route, that ended the grocery shopping mission. The Confederates had to withdraw from that and unite all of their logistics at the mountains to get them to go over, and then a battle would have to be fought at least to cover those supplies escaping for no other reason. Buford created that circumstance with his 8-mile ride west of Gettysburg. So Buford sent that word of having found Heath and A.P. Hill 8 miles west of Gettysburg down to General Meade. By then he was in Taneytown, Maryland, about 14 miles south of Gettysburg. And Meade agreed to allow this offensive option to continue to exist. And he coached John Reynolds, who was in charge of half the army and who was mirroring those mountains and trying to keep track of Confederate movements along those mountains. He had half the army. It was known as the left wing. John Reynolds told Buford, first of all, Meade told Reynolds that I ask you to go to Gettysburg not because you have to fight there, but to give you the prospects of offense. You want to have offense and defense. You all know that. If you defend a defensive position like, let's say, Little Round Top, or let's say Lookout Mountain, or some really steep place, you're signaling to your opponent you're not going to fight offense, which ties one hand behind your back. You're now predictable. He knows you're not going to attack him. He'll attack you more carelessly because he's not worried about the boomerang effect of you attacking him and making him pay for overcommitting. You're signaling by taking up certain positions that you're fighting merely defensive. So if you take up an offensive position, your opponent has to think twice before they approach. If they make a mistake, overcommit in the wrong place, they're going to pay for it with your counterattack because you've positioned yourself to counterattack. So Meade, to not be predictable, remember Lee, when he heard Meade was in charge, he said, Meade, he'll make no mistake on my front. That's what Lee said out loud in front of Spy Harrison on the night of June 28, 27 miles west of here in Chambersburg, when that spy came into Lee's tent and said, Hooker's resigned, Meade's in charge. Lee knew Meade from West Point. He said, he'll make no mistake on my front. Engineers measured twice, cut once. Meade would plan offensives at the same time he would plan for defenses. You could accuse him after the battle of wanting to retreat, but at the same time, their preliminary orders he gave on the second day to make an attack. He was not a chameleon. He was smart. He covered all his bases. You didn't know what he was going to do. Lee, interestingly, admitted that and then still suffered from that. Maybe didn't keep it in mind well enough when the battle occurred. So Meade continued to open this option, and he told Reynolds, you don't have to stay that. If you're uncomfortable in Gettysburg, you can fall back across the Maryland border. He said, I sent you to Gettysburg so there would be prospects of an offensive. I gave you that option of going on the offensive. And so that's all Reynolds needed to hear. And Reynolds conversed with Buford from Moritz Tavern, was where Reynolds was 5 miles south, with Buford, who had set up headquarters at the Eagle Hotel in the town on Washington Street. And the conversing back and forth, Reynolds said, if the Confederates, those Confederates you saw 8 miles west of Gettysburg, if they try to enter the town, do not let them enter the town. The idea was, if the Confederates gain access to the hub of the wheel, where all the roads are, they have access for roads, hardbed roads in every direction. The Union Army would, if the Confederates controlled, for instance, Cemetery Hill at the end of the first day of the battle wouldn't have been fought here any longer. It doesn't mean the Union Army wouldn't have been fully intact and ready to fight again, but they wouldn't have been able to fight here. Why? Because shoed horses and 500 pounds of ammunition can't gallivant through fields like this. They have to be on hard roads, and it needs to be flat. And the 3 roads the Union Army would transfer their defense from Maryland, of Washington, from Maryland to Pennsylvania on, the Emmitsburg Road, the Taneytown Road, the Baltimore Pike, they all dovetail at Cemetery Hill. So for your wagons to all be able to meet and not stay separated on roads, you have to find the nexus point where they come together, and that's Cemetery Hill. So that's a position that has to be held. Now also from Reynolds' perspective, you have to develop out in this direction. If you'll notice that last hill line out there, it's known as Wolf Hill, and intermingled with it is Brinkerhoff Ridge, several miles away. Out along that area there was where the Union Railroad connection came in. That's also where the water supply was, Rock Creek. So if you're going to set up a line of battle, Cemetery Ridge, for instance, and Cemetery Hill, it needs to be parallel with your water supply, which should be about 3 miles behind the line. Why? Because your hospitals are there. You don't want your hospitals too close to the lines, overshots hit them and flush them out. You don't want your hospitals to be too far behind the line, because a horse and a wagon won't get the wounded there in time to survive. So you have to find some happy ground. It's not too close for overshots and not too far for men to make it. So the Cemetery Ridge line was carefully chosen in relation to Rock Creek. Does that make sense? So your hospitals are behind your Cemetery Ridge line. Also covering the Taneytown Road. You never go into a battle without protecting your way out. You don't go into a battle without finding your escape route. Firefighters don't go into a burning building unless it's a real desperate situation, unless they first identify the escape route. And so those 3 roads, the Baltimore Pike, the Emmitsburg Road, the Taneytown Road, have to be held at all times. And the Gordian knot that ties them together is Cemetery Hill. And the water supply that reinforces it is Rock Creek. So it's really your Rock Creek line is what you're establishing. Also, what's important to note here behind the Cemetery Ridge line is the Taneytown Road. If the Union Army loses Cemetery Ridge at any point, they lose the Taneytown Road. And all the supplies that they have here, the 38,000 horses and mules pulling miles of ambulance, ordnance wagons, artillery vehicles, have to now leave on one road, because you lose the Emmitsburg Road on the second day. That's one of your avenues of approach. If you lose Cemetery Ridge with Pickett's charge, you lose the Taneytown Road. That means you got a traffic jam with everybody leaving on the one road that's left open, the Baltimore Pike, with cavalry threatening the escape. Can you all see that? It's not just ridges. There's thousands of ridges in Pennsylvania, just like Cemetery Ridge. It's only important as it interlocks with water and road. And so you lose a ridge, you lose a road, you lose an escape route. There's no way out. Your way home is compromised. And the Confederates had intentionally ripped out rail all in this area, 100 miles of rail, not consistently every single tie, but they would create like a pothole that PennDOT has to repair. They would rip out several ties, set a fire, take the rail, put the rail over the fire, bend it, long before Sherman's neckties. The Confederates did that in Pennsylvania, and then toss it into the woods in a train going along about 40 miles an hour suddenly is airborne. And they did that with they covered 100 miles of rail. These are not anger management problems in the Confederate Army. This was to try to reduce the Union Army's logistical capability to pre-modern forms of transportation, horse and mule, put them on level footing with the Confederates. The Confederates didn't have locomotives. They couldn't use the rail, so they tore it up. Pickett's division was ripping out rail behind those mountains the first day of the battle, 160 years ago today. Why were they doing that? So that Union troops from Harrisburg didn't show up behind that mouse hole escape. So they ripped out all those transportations. How did Robert E. Lee escape? The reason Robert E. Lee escaped is he fought 3 battles. In a battle, you keep 3 days rations, and you keep 3 days worth of supplies. And the wagons that are in excess, you move 15 miles from the battlefield. That's why many of the Union wagons were moved south of Union Mills and towards Westminster. Why? Because you don't want the wagons clogging access for troops marching to the field, or if you suddenly have to leave, you don't want them in the way. It's like walking into a room where a kid has put toys out and they didn't clean it up, and you're afraid of falling and breaking your ankle. There's nowhere to step. That's what it's like if you don't remove the wagons far from the battlefield. So General Lee knew the Southerners. General Lee knew that the Union Army had 3 days rations on their troops and 3 days worth of supplies in their wagons. And if he fought 3 days, he probably knew he had lost the battle on the second day. But he had to make the attack on the third day to make sure the Union Army used up its rations and most of its ammunition. So when they started to escape over the mountains, he knew the Union Army didn't have rail to quickly resupply. That's why he got a 48-hour start and got out of here. Does everybody see that? So it's the great escape with supplies. This is all big picture points to make that are critical. So when Reynolds came to the field, Buford already knew this. Custer's cavalry was here on June 28th. A lot of people don't know that. They were here on June 28th, and they rode along the Hanover-Gettysburg line, rail line, all the way towards Hanover Junction, a little over 20 miles east of here, and saw where the Confederates had torn up the rail. In fact, if you count the intersection of rail and York along the northern central, the Confederates burned 22 bridges, mostly rail bridges. And Custer's cavalry, we're not sure if Custer was with them or not. He may have been, but his 5th and 6th Michigan got here on June 28th, a day before Buford, and rode along the rail line and saw the damage done by White's Comanches, 35th Virginia Battalion of Cavalry. Saw all that damage and went out. And then, did you know that when the battle was occurring on July 1st, did you know engineers were behind that last distinct ridge line that you see there, trying to repair the Hanover-Gettysburg line so they could bring up horses, so they could bring up medical equipment, so they could bring up ammunition, so they could bring up more troops. And that's all going to factor into our final stop, which I'm going to make just around the corner in just a minute. But I want you to see that General Meade went, it's in the official reports, it's right there in the ORs that were declassified in the 1880s. Every ranger and guide has their copy of the ORs. They're the declassified reports written here at the time, and memorandums. And if you read the memorandums, I'm thinking volume 27, part 3, which is correspondences, you can go back and follow the timeline on July 1st, and you can see engineers behind the line assessing the damage. Oh, it's going to take us 2 days to repair this rail line. There's 2.5 bridges burned between Hanover and Gettysburg. We think we can fix it. And then you can see Meade being informed of all of this. So as Meade was considering shifting his defense here, he was also looking at repairing the infrastructure so his army could sustain a presence here for well beyond 24 hours. Okay, we're going to make one more stop. We're going to bring it all together, Longstreet, Meade, at the end of the first day. So General Meade had a real decision on his hand. If he stayed in Maryland, rail was secure between Westminster and Baltimore and Washington, D.C., and it was all connected, Western Maryland and the B&O line, and he was in good shape there for the most part, although there had to be some repair done on the B&O line. Confederates did tear up portions of that towards Harper's Ferry. But there were solid connections back to the capital. And just like today, cell phone towers usually will be placed in cuts in the middle of the side of a mountain where there's already existing utility cables, because the right-of-way has been established between private property. It's just easier to put the cell phone tower where the high wires already exist. And in a similar way, telegraph followed rail because it was already a negotiated right-of-way there. So you had your telegraph lines and your rail lines connected. Armies would follow rail lines because they're always the shortest distance between point A and point B. Roads tend to wind. Railroads go straight. So you look on a map. Why did Stuart take the route he took? Why did he take the route he took from Westminster to Hanover to Carlisle? Because he was following the rail line the whole time, and he was ripping up rail the entire time. And he was also cutting telegraph lines, like Hurricane Sandy, where you couldn't take a shower after, and unless you had a generator, you had no electricity. There was a power failure in this area. This area was cut off from the outside world for 5 days until the rail lines were repaired. The Southerners debilitated the rail systems and the telegraph lines so that they could fight an isolated battle where everything was on equal footing and there were pre-modern forms of transportation and communication. So Meade knew that if he came to Gettysburg, he was further north than he was comfortable from his base of operations in Washington. A lot of bad things can go on around behind you this far north. The enemy can just ride around behind you and set fire to wagon trains. Very dangerous thing. However, if he stayed in Maryland, there's no guarantee Lee would have ever marched into Maryland. Lee might have just taken the supplies, gone over the mountain. He might have stayed here several weeks, maybe a couple of months. Just continued to get what's to cause Lee to leave if he's living off the harvest up here. If you're Meade, you have to do something. That's why this offensive operation was open to Reynolds. You've got to arrest their movements, not just politically, but the Confederates might stay here indefinitely. There's no need for them to attack you in Maryland. So Reynolds worked this situation out with Buford that if the Confederates try to enter the town, resist their movements. And meanwhile, Reynolds would use that time to bring up his infantry. And as more of his infantry arrived, he could fight a delay action, a defense in depth here west of town, north of town, and then gradually fall back if he had to, if he didn't have the numbers by the end of the first day of the battle. And of course, those are things that you're well versed in. But as Meade looked at the situation, to move into Pennsylvania meant repairing the rail. So his engineers started working right away. And there were 400 workers approximately behind the lines repairing rail. African Americans, they were former slaves who were brought into Union lines and freed, and they were paid, and they were working alongside Irishmen. And they were working behind the lines with Harman, that incredible wizard who so many times rebuilt bridges that were burned. Harman had a reputation of rebuilding burned bridges so quickly. By 1864, the Confederates quit burning bridges. He would build prefab bridges in a warehouse yard and then put them on the back of a flatbed, take them to where the breach was where the Confederates had burned a bridge, and then in sections, like you buying a home that's put on a flatbed and taken to your house, it's pre-made. He had pre-made bridges, and and the Southerners just despaired in 1864 and quit trying to sabotage the rail bridges. But that same Harman was working with 400 men, African American and Irishmen, laborers, and they tried to speed up the repair by every fourth tie they would put down one tie. So it wasn't as stable, but it allowed them to quickly repair from Hanover towards Gettysburg. Now, at the end of the first day, we'll go through this quickly. We're looking at big picture the whole time. You've noticed you went through the details of the battle on the earlier program, so we're just looking at big picture strategy. When the Union Army fell back through the town to Cemetery Hill was a place that they absolutely had to hold. They absolutely had to hold that. I don't want to be redundant. That's where the three roads come together. Union Army can't unify here in Pennsylvania in their defense of Washington without holding that Gordian knot tie there. However, the original plan that Reynolds had in place was for the Union line to extend. You see that radio tower out there in the distance? In that vicinity behind it is a blue water tower. It's called Benner's Hill. The Union's plan was to fall back from here to there and not have the line curve back and become Culp's Hill. The reason why they were to fall back without their line bending was that they had to cover the rail line while it was being repaired. They also had to keep Confederate access from the other side of the battlefield, east of Gettysburg, where there would eventually be 38,000 horses and mules pulling miles of ambulances, ordnance wagons, wheeled vehicles of all kinds parked there. If the Confederates had ever gotten through and broken through to the Baltimore Pike, this is tragic, but they would shoot the first horse. There's 6 horses and mules pulling a wheeled vehicle. That wounded horse won't work in unison with the other 5. Now you've stranded one of the vehicles. Then you just walk up with torches and start setting fire to the wagons. You got 20 miles worth of wagon trains on fire. So General Meade would not want General Lee to be east of Gettysburg, where he has a wide angle from the Hanover Road, ready access, easier access to the Baltimore Pike, where all the wheeled vehicles are. All right, that side of the battlefield too, east of Gettysburg, is where the rail lines are being repaired. That's where your main artery is, the Baltimore Pike, with all the wheeled vehicles. That's where your water supply is and all your hospitals. You don't want the enemy around you on the east side of you. The reason the 5th Corps marched up, not on the primary 3 roads, Emmitsburg Road, Baltimore Pike, Tinytown Road, but they took the Hanover Road, marched 56 miles in 3 days, and came in squarely from the east, is to sweep any Confederates on that side of town so that the engineers could be working on the railroad behind them. So that's why they came in. Sometimes when I used to close the visitor center, I would do a sweep. A sweep is you go around, you make sure nobody's behind you, okay, and then you lock a door, it's secure there. 5th Corps came in on the Hanover Road. Primarily, they took a wide arc march from the east to sweep any Confederates still east of Gettysburg and make sure they stayed in front of them. That's on this side of town, so that there would be no one messing with the rail lines over there. So that's what Reynolds would have ultimately wanted to do, is to keep the line straight. When your line is bent back, that's a compromised position. And it allows your enemy to have a base to surround and crossfire your apex. So Cemetery Hill becomes vulnerable by way of attacking Culp's Hill and by attacking up the Emmitsburg Road towards a pincer and critical mass on that hill. You can avoid that if your line never bends. Think of a paperclip and unbending it and being straight. The Union line was very much like a paperclip during the battle in its normal shape. What General Meade wanted to do was extend it and bend it straight, parallel with his water supply, and to cover the rail supply that was being worked on. That's what he wanted ideally. Cemetery Hill became the place you absolutely had to hold, though, or your wheeled vehicles couldn't come together. Now, from the southern perspective, at the end of the first day, Confederates were attacking from my right to left. That would be from west to east. And then down in these fields below, the 11th Corps put up a heroic fight, but Confederates got around behind them. And the word got out that the 11th Corps' flank had been turned. 1st Corps had fought to a frazzle. They had held all day. But as the retreat started towards the town, the line was already compromised at that point because Confederates were getting around that side of the battlefield. And General Ewell's Corps went into the town, and they couldn't pursue very far because of earlier steps taken by Reynolds to use the town as a sort of like a spaghetti strainer. Think of spaghetti and water being poured into a strainer. And the water goes through the strainer, but the spaghetti gets caught in the strainer and doesn't go through. The water going through the strainer we'll call the Union Army going through the town. The town is the strainer, the labyrinth. And the Confederates pursuing are the spaghetti wrapped around the building. How did it work that way? Because Reynolds, who had been breveted for street fighting in Buena Vista and Monterey in the Mexican War, understood that the town itself was a contingency to hold Cemetery Hill, where the 3 roads came together. You had to absolutely hold that hill. So the town itself was turned into a mouse maze. Chester drawers, vanities, kitchen tables were taken out of houses and blocked most of the roads through the town. When the Union Army fell back into the town at the end of the day, sometime after 3:30, and they were falling back towards Cemetery Hill, there were officers, Union officers in the town, almost like highway signalmen, directing traffic down the roads that were open. The Confederates had no one directing them around the barricades, and they found themselves in back alleys where there was stacked up furniture, and the city, the town, particleized, atomized, and broke up their pursuit. Does that make sense? Reynolds wasn't around to see that, tragically killed in the morning, but he had put that contingency in place. In fact, we'll get goosebumps telling the story. His last note that he sent to Meade, who read it down in Taneytown, when Meade was reading and he didn't know it, that he was reading the words of Reynolds, who had already passed away. The horse was told, or the man riding the horse, the messenger was told, if the horse dies, go at breakneck speed to get this message with utmost speed to Meade down in Taneytown. So it's a 14-mile gallop, and he gets off the horse and he hands this note to Meade. It's from Reynolds, and it says, if I have to fight them inch by inch through the town and barricade the streets, he tells you he's going to do that. I'll do that to defend the heights south of town. So he sees as a situation where he might get flanked from the east. There were Confederates marching back from York, and you've got to at least hold Cemetery Hill, because there are Union troops en route on roads, and they have to have a nexus point, and you've got to control that. So the town is used as a contingency, a last-ditch effort to slow a Confederate pursuit if it comes to that. Does everybody see that? That's so important. It takes us right into Reynolds' brain. So the situation then was, as the Union Army fell back through the town, 1st Corps this way, 11th Corps that way, 1st Corps this way, 11th Corps that way, and officers were directing them, and some of the men heard it and some didn't. And then some Union troops went around the town, south, right to Cemetery Ridge. They just circumvented the town, and Buford's cavalry moved south of the town to keep the Confederates from approaching Cemetery Hill from the south, or directly from the west or from the south. In fact, Buford extended his cavalry all the way down to the peach orchard and beyond, so the Confederates wouldn't have an artillery platform to try to rake the Union lines along Cemetery Ridge. So that was going on long before Sickles had moved out. That was Buford holding the peach orchard at the end of the first day. Geary's 12th Corps guys came up to support behind him. And as General Lee was looking at this situation, from his perspective, his goal at this point, if he was going to remain on the offense, was to dislodge the Union Army. On July 4th, the day after Pickett's charge, he wrote a very brief note to Jefferson Davis, his commander-in-chief. It was put in a metal box and handed to Imboden, a cavalry commander, who was with that 17-mile wagon of woe train of wounded. The wounded went out first. They went through the Cashtown Pass, while the infantry went through south of here through the Fairfield Pass, so that the wounded and supplies could take a wider arc while the infantry took an inner arc on the retreat. That would allow the Confederates infantry to be a buffer between them and their wounded and their wagon trains. Do you see that? So, but you had to give Imboden a head start. Imboden was handed a note from Lee, written to Jefferson Davis. Davis would have read it days later, but it read that I failed to dislodge the enemy from his main position and gain possession of his position. And I remember, Ben, years ago when I read that, I thought, I could have written something more detailed than that. He's not telling me anything here. And what does that mean? And you can actually see that it's telling you nothing and just read over it. It was my problem. It took me years to understand that Lee's entire offensive aspect of his battle plan, never mind the logistics of protecting the retreat, of getting the supplies out, but from an offensive perspective, it's all right there in that short letter to Jefferson Davis on July 4th. I failed to dislodge. All right, dislodge is a military term. It's a loaded term. If you knew no other word from Robert E. Lee's battle plan and you heard dislodge, you now know Robert E. Lee's battle plan. It's no longer a mystery. Dislodge means get something moving. Try to imagine a tree, and it's in a river, and it has branches, and your goal is to get the tree floating down the river, but the branches are scraping the basin. and you take a chainsaw and you remove the branches, and you keep trying to leverage it with maybe with a 2x4, and the water gets muddy, trying to paint a picture for you, and that tree just won't move, and you work and you work and you remove the root systems with your saw, and finally, after a heave and a hoe of removing every impediment, you push the tree trunk, now absent of its roots and many of its branches, and it floats downstream. Everybody got that picture of it floating away from you? Yeah. All right, that's dislodge. Dislodge is to get something moving. It's like a car is stuck in a ditch in the winter. Several people come up behind the bumper and they get behind it, and the person working, let's say it's a manual clutch, and they're trying to get the movement of the car rocking just at the right push, and then it climbs up out of the ditch, and you have to keep the thing moving as it comes up out of the ditch. And you keep pushing because it's trying to swim in the snow, but finally gets traction, there's enough momentum, and it rolls. That's dislodging something. General Lee, at the end of the first day, if you really understand what he was thinking, based on what he wrote to Davis, he got the Union Army dislodged. He got the tree moving. He got the car rolling. It's swimming on the snow, but it's moving and it's going back. You can't let it stop. It's like you can't stop pushing the car when it's climbed out of the snowy ditch. You got to keep pushing it, or it may get stuck again. And who knows how much longer you're going to have to throw gravel under the tires to get it moving again. The Confederates worked all day long to pry loose, to shoehorn loose the Union forces and get them rolling back. And now they're dislodged, and then they lodge like the tree catching something, and it stops. And you're not going to be able to move it maybe for 48 hours. Cemetery Hill, Little Round Top, Culp's Hill is where it lodged. And he spent the rest of the battle going, trying to push the thing and getting it moving. The reason why Lee attacked on 3 sides of the Union line, the sides and then directly at Cemetery Hill, well, somewhat directly with Early's attack, notice the one place Lee didn't attack the remaining 2 days. He didn't circle around behind the Union line and draw a line in the sand and fight defensively like Longstreet wanted to do. The reason is you would have been not dislodging, you would have been blocking the Union Army. Not dislodging it, you would have helped further lodge the Union Army. And when you draw a line in the sand and block your opponent's way home, they're going to fight with a level of desperation that you can rarely match. If you leave a way out, your opponent fights less desperately because they have a way out. It's that way. It's human nature that way. As long as you think you have another day to pay a bill or whatever, you'll probably wait another day. When it's desperate, you get really eager, and it's that way in an argument. Let's say, Ben, you and I were having a debate, and in that debate, there's a moment where I'm clearly wrong, and I think a number of people know that I'm wrong, and instead of saying, hey, I'm wrong, hey, I learned something today, instead I sort of dig my heels in, and there's a moment where you can give me a graceful way out. Sun Tzu said, if you give your opponent a way out, sometimes he takes it. It's that way interpersonally. You give me a graceful way out, I leave, I get in the car, go to dinner, and I have an evening in this sort of forgotten, and you gave me a graceful way out. But if you pin me in a corner and I have to fight, I'll show my teeth, and because I'm fighting more desperately, you put me in a situation where I can't easily escape. So notice Lee never attacked the Union line across the escape route. He was trying to dislodge the Union. That's why Longstreet was not allowed to go beyond the Round Tops. That's why even though the Confederates attacking on Culp's Hill could hear wagon trains on the Baltimore Pike, they were never allowed to advance on the Baltimore Pike. There were never enough Confederate troops to extend across the Baltimore Pike to be effective. Why? Because Lee was trying to press, like squeezing a tube of toothpaste, the Union bend in the fishhook, and then get the toothpaste to come out. That is, the Union Army to dislodge and go south, and then pursue. Now, politically, had the Union Army ever retreated across the Maryland border? Let's say that had happened. And let's say they did it in an orderly fashion. Very hard. Once you lose Cemetery Hill, now you're separated on 3 roads. If you lose the Emmitsburg Road and the Taneytown Road, now every equipment you brought to Gettysburg has to leave on 1 road. So you've got an I-95 traffic jam. It's just backed up forever. With cavalry, Union cavalry trying to protect a long line of wagons, and then troops in the way, could be a disaster. So what Lee is looking at is the Union Army is lodged, and he's got to dislodge them again. That's the whole point of the argument with Ewell. Seize the heights south of town if practicable without bringing on a general engagement or until reinforcements arrive. Ewell's there. He's on the scene. You give him the latitude to make the decision. He knows that it's taken all day to dislodge the Union Army. You don't want them to lodge again. He knows that. But Lee is not there. He doesn't want to lose time. Windows of opportunity open and close in 30 minutes in a battle, never to reopen again. Like when you go to buy a home sometime or a car. You don't have complete information, but you know that in 30 minutes that car is going to be sold. You know, all of us have had those instances in our life if we're old enough. And we just go with our instincts. We don't have complete knowledge. We didn't get to take the car to our mechanic and look it over carefully. But we go ahead and take a chance and buy it. That's what it's like for a general on a battlefield. There are moments like that that present themselves. And the great generals recognize that moment. It may take 2 days for one moment like that to present itself. And once that opportunity closes, it usually opens and closes for 30 minutes. When it closes, just like that car is sold, you don't get that opportunity again. So at the end of the first day, General Lee knows that the circumstances are really difficult. The Confederates are fought to a frazzle. The Union Army is lodging on a very strong position. You don't know how many Union troops are within marching distance, how close they are. You attack, you might run into twice your numbers. There's a lot of things to consider. This is not in any way to condemn Ewell. It's to say, though, that he also knows that it took an awful lot to push this car out of the ditch or to get that tree floating down the road. He dislodged them here, and now they're lodged again. Had the Union Army ever, though, retreated, politically, a retreat across the Maryland border